I was setting up my mom's new smart TV until her texts synced live to the screen and exposed my future father-in-law. So, used to think the hardest part of planning my wedding was going to be coordinating the seating chart for 60 opinionated family members. My fiancé Mark and I had been together for 3 years, and our relationship was built on a foundation of absolute transparency. We were exactly 4 weeks away from our wedding day, and the excitement in our lives was palpable. Both of our families lived in the same suburban grid, and on paper, the blending of our worlds looked flawless. Mark's parents, Richard and Helen, had been married for 35 years and were considered pillars of our local community. My mom, Eleanor, had been a quiet widow for the last 3 years since my dad passed away. Because my mom had been so lonely, Mark and I made a conscious effort to keep her involved in our daily lives. For her 55th birthday, Mark and I pooled our money to buy her a state-of-the-art 65-inch smart television to replace the ancient, flickering box in her living room. On a Tuesday afternoon, while Mark was out of town finalizing his bachelor weekend details with his groomsmen, I drove over to my mom's house to surprise her and get the new system mounted and calibrated before her birthday dinner the following evening. "Oh, Chloe, it's absolutely beautiful," my mom gasped, smoothing down her linen apron as she watched me unbox the massive screen. "But you know how terrible I am with technology. I'm gonna ruin it." "You won't ruin anything, Mom," I laughed, lifting the screen onto the console table and plugging in the HDMI feeds. "It has a universal syncing feature. Once I link your phone to the local network, you can control everything right from your screen. You won't even need to use the physical remote." I spent the next hour configuring the applications, connecting her home Wi-Fi, and linking her personal cloud profile to the TV's master operating system. To ensure the casting feature worked correctly, I enabled the Live Smart Sync option, setting that allowed her phone notifications to display briefly in the top corner of the screen so she wouldn't miss messages while watching her evening programs. "All right, Mom, give me your phone," I said, stretching my arms as I stood up from the floor. "I need to accept the Bluetooth pairing request from your device to finish the calibration. It's on the kitchen counter." "Sweetie," she called out, her voice competing with the sound of running water as she started washing vegetables for our lunch. "The passcode is just your birthday." I walked into the kitchen, grabbed her phone, and entered the code. I opened her settings, activated the Bluetooth link, and walked back into the living room. On the massive 65-inch display, a large blue dialog box flashed, "Device Eleanor's phone connected," initializing real-time notification mirror. I pressed the confirmation button on the remote, intending to lock her phone and head back into the kitchen. But before my fingers could slide across the power button, her phone vibrated violently in my palm. At that exact microsecond, the top right quadrant of the television screen flashed with a giant, glowing text notification banner. The message wasn't from a local boutique or one of her church friends. The contact name saved on her phone, displaying in bold white letters against the dark screen, read, "Richard, Mark's dad." My thumb froze over the screen. I looked up at the television, my brow furrowing in mild confusion. I didn't even know my mom had Richard's personal cell number. Usually, any communication between our families went through Mark's mother, Helen, or through Mark himself. Then, the second notification dropped, sliding over the first one with a crisp digital chime. "Richard, Mark's dad. The suite at the Willow Boutique Hotel is booked under my partner name for Friday afternoon. Helen thinks I'm at a regional scouting conference. Tell me you can make it by 2 what?" I can't stop thinking about last weekend. The phone in my hand suddenly felt like a block of dry ice burning right through my skin. My chest tightened so violently that I couldn't draw a breath. I stared at the giant screen, the text characters searing themselves into my retinas. The Willow Boutique Hotel, Friday afternoon, last weekend. Before my brain could even attempt to construct a safe, innocent excuse for what I was looking at, a third message flashed onto the 65-inch display, and this one contained a high-resolution media attachment. It was a photograph. It was a picture of Richard, Mark's father, standing in a brightly lit bathroom, wearing a plush white hotel robe, smiling into the mirror with an expression of familiar, intimate arrogance. The caption beneath the photo read, "Richard, Mark's dad, counting down the hours, Ellie. Our little secret is the only thing keeping me sane before this wedding circus officially begins next month." I stood rooted to the hardwood floor of my mother's living room, the glossy television screen reflecting the absolute pale mask of horror on my face. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with a brutal, sickening force. The sudden, coincidental meetings at the local grocery store, my mom's sudden interest in gardening tips that Richard supposedly specialized in, the quiet, secretive smiles they exchanged during our joint family engagement dinners. It wasn't family bonding. My mother was having a live, active affair with my future father-in-law. The wedding that Mark and I had spent a year planning, the family structure we believed was a sanctuary of stability, and the pure, innocent image of my grieving mother. All of it was a beautifully coordinated facade. They were sneaking around behind Helen's back, behind Mark's back, and behind mine, using the distraction of our upcoming wedding as the perfect smokescreen to hide their betrayal. "Chloe?" My mom's voice called out from the kitchen, the sound of her footsteps approaching the living room threshold. "Did the syncing work, honey? Is the television ready?" A survival instinct, sharp and frozen, instantly took over my body. I snapped my head toward her phone, my fingers flying across the screen mirroring app. With 2 rapid taps, I deactivated the live display sync, wiping the text banners from the television screen just a fraction of a second before my mom walked through the archway, holding a tray of sandwiches. "Everything is working perfectly?" "Mom," I said, my voice sounding completely completely hollow, as if I were speaking from the bottom of a deep, dark well. I locked her phone, set it face down on the coffee table, and forced my eyes to meet hers. She looked so small, so innocent, wearing her linen apron and offering me a warm, motherly smile. It was terrifying how easily a person could look you in the eye while carrying a secret that could burn 2 families to the ground. Great, she chirped, setting the tray down. Let's have some lunch. I looked at the sandwiches, feeling a violent surge of nausea rise in my throat. Mark was coming home from his trip on Thursday evening. The affair was happening on Friday afternoon. I had exactly 48 hours to figure out how to stop this train before it slammed into our lives, and I wasn't going to let them hide in the dark for a single second longer. The human brain is a strange machine under extreme stress. As I sat across from my mother at the kitchen table, watching her delicately cut her sandwich and complain about the rising cost of utilities, my mind wasn't in the room. It was running calculations at 1,000,000 miles an hour. If I called Mark right now and told him his dad was sleeping with my mom, the sheer shock would shatter him. But worse, Richard was a powerful, manipulative man who had spent 35 years controlling the narrative in his own home. If I confronted them without undeniable visual proof, Richard would claim my mom was text stalking him, or my mom would claim she was just counseling Richard through a marital rough hatch. They would delete the evidence, play the victims, and I would become the crazy, paranoid daughter-in-law who tried to destroy the family weeks before the wedding. I couldn't let them suspect I knew. Not yet. Chloe, you've barely touched your food, sweetie, my mom noted, her brow furrowing with a soft, feigned maternal worry. Are you feeling all right? Is the wedding stress getting to you? I looked up, forcing my facial muscles to relax into a practiced, tired smile. Yeah, Mom. Just a little overwhelmed with the final catering numbers. I think I'm going to head home early to rest before Mark gets back into town. Of course, honey. Take care of yourself, she said, reaching across the table to pat my hand. Her skin felt entirely toxic against mine. The moment I got into my car, my hands began to shake so violently I could barely slot the key into the ignition. I drove straight to my apartment, locked the door, and opened my laptop. Before leaving my mom's house, while she was looking for a Tupperware container in the pantry, I had used my own phone to take high-resolution photos of the text threads, the hotel booking reference, and the bathroom selfie Richard had sent her. I sat at my desk, staring at the digital folder on my laptop. The hotel reservation was for this coming Friday at the Willow Boutique Hotel, a secluded, high-end resort nestled in the Valley Woods about 45 minutes outside our town. Richard's excuse to his wife, Helen, was a regional scouting conference. My mom's excuse to me, which she had casually dropped during lunch, was that she was spending Friday afternoon visiting an old college friend out of town. They had synchronized their alibis perfectly. I spent the rest of Tuesday evening and all of Wednesday acting like a ghost in my own life. When Mark called me on Wednesday night from his hotel room, his voice full of excitement and love as he talked about how much he missed me and how close we were to the big day, I had to physically bite the inside of my cheek to keep from crying. I love you. Chloe, Mark said, his voice a warm, steady anchor in the dark. Only 4 weeks left until we're officially a team forever. I love you too, Mark, I whispered, the tears finally spilling silently down my cheeks in the dark bedroom. More than anything, he had no idea that the team he thought we were building was surrounded by a minefield planted by his own father and my mother. I didn't tell him that night. If I broke his heart now, he would be paralyzed by the grief. He needed to see the truth in an environment where the liars couldn't spin their web. On Thursday evening, Mark returned home. I met him at the door, hugging him with a fierce, desperate intensity that startled him slightly. Whoa, missing me that much, huh? He laughed, kissing my forehead and dropping his duffel bag by the closet. How was your week? Did you get your mom's TV set up? Yeah, I said, turning away to hide the sudden sharp flash of pain in my eyes as I walked into the kitchen to pour him a glass of water. The TV is set up perfectly, Mark. In fact, it's going to show us things we never expected to see. What's that mean? He asked, walking up behind me and wrapping his arms around my waist. Just that the picture quality is incredible, I lied smoothly, leaning back into his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. Tomorrow was Friday, the day of the hotel reservation. I had already made a call to a local freelance event photographer named Sarah, whom I had hired under the pretense of doing some secret, pre-wedding location scouting for our outdoor shoot near the Valley Woods. I gave her the exact address of the Willow Boutique Hotel and the timestamp. Friday afternoon, 1:45 p.m. Vince and Richard thought they were sliding into a quiet, luxurious weekend of stolen moments. They had no idea that every step they took out of their cars was going to be documented by a high shutter speed zoom lens, and the gallery was going to be delivered straight to me. Friday morning arrived with a cold, gray overcast that matched the freezing weight in my stomach. Mark left the apartment at 7:30 a.m. for a full-day corporate seminar in the city, leaving me alone with my laptop, my phone, and a ticking clock. At 11 a.m., my mom called me. Her voice was light, cheerful, and entirely regular. Hi, Chloe. Just checking in before I head out. I'm about to hit the road to see my old roommate, Brenda, up north. I probably won't have great cell service in the valley, so don't worry if I don't answer your texts until late tonight. Have a safe drive, Mom, I said, my voice completely devoid of any inflection. Give Brenda my best. I will, sweetie. Love you. The call clicked off. 10 minutes later, Mark's mother, Helen, texted me a picture of a beautiful floral arrangement she was considering for our head wedding table. Helen, what do you think of these white roses, Chloe? Richard just left for his scouting conference, so I have the whole afternoon to finalize the centerpieces. Let me know. I stared at the text from Helen, a woman who had spent more than 3 decades building a life with a man who was currently adjusting his tie in a rearview mirror, driving toward a betrayal that would wipe that sweet, excited smile off her face forever. Chloe, they look beautiful. Helen, why don't we hold off on the final decision until tomorrow? I think we're going to have a lot more clarity by then. At 1:30 p.m., I parked my car in the gravel lot of a public park a quarter-mile down the road from the Willow Boutique Hotel. I didn't want my vehicle spotted in the resort's small, exclusive driveway. I sat in the driver's seat, my phone resting on the dashboard, waiting. At 1:52 p.m., my phone buzzed. It was a secure link from Sarah, the photographer. I opened the folder. The first image was a crisp, high-definition shot of Richard's luxury SUV pulling into the resort's valet circle. Richard stepped out, wearing a pair of expensive sunglasses, looking around the parking lot with a quick, cautious sweep of his head before handing his keys to the attendant. The next photo, time-stamped 10 minutes later, showed my mother's compact sedan pulling into the side lot. She wasn't wearing her linen apron today. She was wearing a beautiful silk wrap dress I had never seen before, her hair styled perfectly. The third photograph hit me like a physical punch to the jaw. It was a shot of the resort's secluded outdoor terrace walkway leading to the private cabins. Richard was standing by the door of cabin 14. My mom walked up to him, and the camera captured the moment perfectly. Richard wrapping his arms around her waist, pulling her into a deep, familiar kiss, while her hand rested flat against his chest. There was no ambiguity. There was no misunderstanding. It was an ironclad, high-definition portrait of absolute infidelity. "I have everything you asked for, Chloe," Sarah texted me a minute later. "They've entered the cabin. Do you need me to stay for the exit shots?" "No, Sarah," I typed back, my fingers cold but steady against the screen. "You've done an incredible job. Send the full resolution files to my private email link. Destroy any local copies on your drive. Thank you." I closed my phone, leaned my head back against the headrest, and closed my eyes. The feeling of devastation that had broken me on Tuesday afternoon was gone. In its place was a hard, calcified wall of pure, tactical focus. Next evening was our joint family rehearsal dinner at the Iron Gate Bistro, an upscale, historic restaurant downtown where we had reserved the private back room for 30 of our closest family members, the wedding party, and our future in-laws. It was meant to be the night of the formal toasts, where Richard was scheduled to deliver a speech welcoming me into the family, and my mom was scheduled to present a childhood video montage she had supposedly spent weeks compiling on a flash drive. It was the perfect venue, and I was going to ensure that the presentation the family watched tomorrow night wasn't a nostalgic look at my childhood, but a terrifying look at the rot that was threatening to destroy our future. When Mark got back from his seminar on Friday night, he noticed the shift in the apartment immediately. The living room table was covered in wedding timelines, seating charts, and the small metallic flash drive my mom had dropped off on our porch earlier that evening while we were out. "Wow, you've been busy," Mark said, throwing his briefcase on the sofa and walking over to kiss my neck. "Is that the childhood slideshow your mom made? She text-checked me 3 times today to make sure it loaded onto the bistro's system correctly." "Yeah," I said, my voice dropping into that quiet, steady register that had become my armor over the last 3 days. "She was very specific about it, Mark. She told me she wanted it to be a complete surprise for everyone at the dinner tomorrow. She said it represents the blending of our 2 histories." "That's really sweet of her," Mark murmured, entirely innocent, smiling down at the little silver drive. "My dad's been stressed about his toast all week, too. He keeps practicing his welcome to the family speech in his study. Helen says he's being incredibly meticulous about it." I looked at Mark's handsome, trusting face, and for a second, a wave of profound sorrow washed over me. He loved his father. He respected his mother. He thought he was stepping into a beautiful, multi-generational legacy of love. Tomorrow, I was going to have to pull the rug out from under his entire world. But I knew that a life built on a lie was just a slow-motion execution anyway. I had to protect him from a lifetime of being manipulated by the man he idolized. "Mark, do me a favor," I said, looking up at him. "Tomorrow night, during the toasts, I want you to sit next to your mom. Hold her hand. She's worked so hard on this wedding, and I think she's going to need to feel her son close to her during the presentation." Mark smiled, his eyes softening. "Of course, Chloe, you're always so thoughtful about my mom." The next morning, the day of the rehearsal dinner arrived. I spent the afternoon at the Iron Gate Bistro, ostensibly checking the audio-visual layout for the private back room. The restaurant's event manager, a polite young man named Julian, escorted me to the master media console hidden behind the decorative mahogany partition at the back of the dining hall. "Your mother's flash drive is already loaded into the primary projection queue." "Miss?" Julian told me, pointing to the glowing monitor interface. "It's scheduled to trigger automatically right after the groom's father finishes his opening remarks. We'll dim the house lights to 10%. "Excellent, Julian," I said, offering a tight professional smile as I stepped closer to the console. But there was a slight update to the media file this morning. My mom wanted to add a few recent family photographs from this month to close out the sequence. "Can I swap the directory out?" "Of course." "Go right ahead," he said, stepping aside to handle a catering delivery at the door. With steady clinical precision, I ejected my mom's original file from the system folder. I pulled a duplicate silver drive from my purse, the drive I had spent the previous night compiling in the dark while Mark slept. The new file was titled The History of Us. It began with the standard, sweet childhood photos my mom had selected, me in a tutu at age 5, Mark holding a baseball bat at age 7. But right in the middle of the directory, precisely interleaved between the nostalgic family portraits, I had injected the high-definition scans plans of the Smart Sync text logs from Tuesday afternoon, the Willow Boutique hotel reservation receipts, and the 3 crystal-clear, high-shutter photographs Sarah had taken of Richard and my mother kissing outside cabin 14 on Friday afternoon. I locked the drive into the master queue, set the program to run in an unskippable looping format, and closed the console cabinet. As I walked out of the empty bistro dining hall into the bright afternoon sun, I felt a calm, freezing clarity settle over my bones. The stage was set, the audience was arriving, and the 2 main characters had no idea that the script they had written in the dark was about to be read aloud to the entire world. The private room at the Iron Gate Bistro was magnificent, lit by glowing iron chandeliers. The long imperial tables decorated with crisp white linens, green ivy runners, and dozens of burning tea lights. 30 of our closest family members, the entire bridal party, and our relatives were already laughing, champagne flutes clinking under the warm, joyful chatter of a successful wedding rehearsal. Mark sat to my right, his hand resting over mine, his eyes crinkling with happiness as he chatted with his groomsmen. To our left sat Helen, looking elegant in a navy lace dress, her face radiant as she looked around the room at the life she had spent 35 years building. And sitting directly across from us, side by side in a display of sickening family unity, were my mother and Richard. My mom was wearing a soft cream dress, her face glowing with a polite, demure smile as she nodded along to a story Richard was telling the table. Richard looked every bit the powerful patriarch, his silver hair perfectly styled, his sharp suit immaculate as he occasionally reached over to pour my mother more wine, his demeanor dripping with the smooth, practiced charm of a man who believed he was completely untouchable. At 8:15 p.m., the event manager stepped to the front of the room, tapping a glass to command attention. Ladies and gentlemen, if you could please settle in for our evening toasts. To kick off the presentations, we have a special welcome speech from the father of the groom, Mr. Richard Sterling. The room erupted into warm, thunderous applause. Richard stood up from his seat, smoothing down the front of his jacket, adjusting his cuffs with an arrogant, self-satisfied smile. He walked to the center podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked out over the room of people who loved and respected him. Integrity. Richard's deep, booming voice echoed through the bistro speakers, instantly silencing the room. When Helen and I look at Mark and Chloe tonight, we don't just see a young couple starting a new chapter. We see the continuation of a legacy built on commitment, on unshakable trust, and on the absolute transparency that keeps a family strong through the generations. I sat at the head table, less than 5 feet away from him, watching his mouth move. The sheer psychopathic audacity of his words was almost breathtaking. "Chloe," Richard said, turning his gaze directly toward me, offering a warm, fatherly nod that made my blood instantly turn to boiling acid. "You are an exceptional woman. You bring a quiet, beautiful grace into our family, much like your wonderful mother, Eleanor, who has raised you with such flawless values since your father's tragic passing." My mom lowered her eyes, a soft, modest flush rising on her cheeks as she offered a sweet, appreciative nod across the table. "So tonight," Richard concluded, raising his champagne glass high under the warm chandelier light, "I want to propose a toast to the values that define us, to honesty, to loyalty, and to the beautiful blending of our 2 histories. Julian, let's run that video presentation, Eleanor. Prepare to show everyone exactly what we're celebrating. Tonight." The room applauded warmly as Richard took a long sip of his champagne and stepped back from the podium. On cue, the heavy iron chandeliers killed completely, plunging the dining hall into an immediate, dramatic 10% ambient twilight. The massive projection screen on the wall behind the podium hissed to life, cutting through the dark with a bright, brilliant beam of white light. The first slide hit the screen. It was a sweet, nostalgic photo of me at age 6, sitting on my dad's shoulders at a beach. A soft, collective awe rippled through the aunts and cousins in the back rows. The next slide showed Mark as a little boy, wearing a giant baseball glove. Then the transition slide hit, and the audio system linked to the screen emitted a sharp, digital chime. It wasn't a childhood photo. It was a massive, crystal-clear, high-definition screenshot of the Smart Sync text threads from Tuesday afternoon. Richard's name and phone number were displayed in giant, luminous text across the 30-foot wall. "Richard, Mark's dad. The suite at the Willow Boutique Hotel is booked. I can't stop thinking about last weekend. Tell me you can make it by 2 Sao." The warm, celebratory chatter in the bistro dining hall died a violent, instantaneous death. The silence that followed was so absolute, so suffocating, that you could hear the individual flames of the tea lights flickering along the tables. Mark's hand, which had been resting over mine, suddenly went completely rigid. I looked across the table. My mother's face went from a soft, modest flush to a horrific, translucent ash gray in a matter of seconds. Her fork dropped from her hand, clinking sharply against her porcelain plate, a sound that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. What is that?" Helen's voice broke the silence, a small, trembling whisper from my left as she leaned forward, her eyes wide with a terrifying, mounting confusion. "Richard, why is your name on the screen?" Richard didn't answer. He was frozen next to the podium, his champagne glass still gripped in his hand, his eyes locked onto the screen with a look of raw, paralyzed horror that completely stripped away his 30 years of unearned power. The next slide advanced automatically. It was the bathroom selfie Richard had sent my mom, followed immediately by the 3 high-shutter photographs Sarah had taken outside cabin 14 just 24 hours ago. The image displayed Richard's arms wrapped tightly around my mother's waist, their lips locked in a passionate, unmistakable embrace under the valley sun. "Oh my God!" one of the bridesmaids gasped from the front table, table, her hand flying over her mouth. Helen stood up from her seat. The movement was slow, her body shaking so violently that she knocked her wine glass over, the dark red liquid spilling across the white linen cloth like a pool of blood. She looked at the screen, then turned her head slowly to look at her husband of 35 years, then at the widow who had sat across from her at every family dinner for a year. "You," Helen breathed, her voice cracking into a ragged, guttural scream of pure, unadulterated agony that tore through the quiet bistro. "You baseline piece of garbage! In our town? With my son's future family? At my son's rehearsal dinner?" The eruption that followed was a complete structural demolition of the Sterling family's fraudulent image. Helen didn't wait for an explanation. She didn't listen to Richard's weak, cracking voice as he tried to grab her arm, stammering that the photos were a malicious digital fabrication. She slapped his hand away with a force that echoed across the room, stripped the gold anniversary band off her finger, and threw it directly into his face before walking out of the bistro into the night, her son Mark following less than 2 paces behind her. Mark didn't look back at his father, and he didn't look at my mother. He went straight to his mom's side, protecting her from the wreckage his father had built. My mom sat frozen in her chair, her head down, her hands covering her face as her own sister and brothers stood up from the table, turning their backs on her in a silent, coordinated exit of absolute disgust. Within 5 minutes, the grand dining hall was completely empty, leaving only the burning tea lights, the spilled red wine, and the 2 liars standing alone under the glowing screen of their own exposure. I stood up from my seat, adjusted the strap of my dress, and looked at my mother one last time. The TV sync worked perfectly. "Mom," I said softly, my voice completely clear of any anger, filled only with the beautiful, freezing weight of absolute finality. "Happy birthday." I walked out of the bistro, the cool evening air hitting my face like a long, clean breath after years of living in a house of mirrors. 3 months passed like a rapid, necessary clearing of a forest fire. The wedding scheduled for that next month was called off, of course, but Mark and I didn't break up. The betrayal wasn't ours. It belonged to the generation before us, and we refused to let their lack of integrity dictate the terms of our future. We packed our bags, walked away from the toxic suburban grid where our parents lived, and moved to a beautiful coastal town 3 hours away, starting fresh in a small apartment overlooking the water. Helen filed for a high-asset divorce within 48 hours of the dinner. Because of the ironclad, time-stamped photographic evidence I provided her legal team, the court proceedings were swift and devastating for Richard. He was forced to liquidate his shares in the local community properties to cover the settlement, his pristine reputation completely toxic to any civic board or social circle in the county. He moved into a small, rented condo near the highway, completely isolated from his son and his former peers. My mom became a ghost in her own neighborhood. Her church groups, her gardening clubs, and her extended family completely cut her off, unable to look past the cruelty of her actions toward a woman who had welcomed her with open arms. She lived alone in her big house, the blinds drawn, the 65-inch smart television sitting dark and unplugged in her empty living room. It was a crisp Saturday afternoon in May. Exactly 1 year since the afternoon the text notifications had synced to the screen. I stood in the kitchen of our new coastal apartment, the room flooded with bright, clean sunlight and the scent of fresh ocean air. The counters were covered in design blueprints for a small children's speech therapy practice. Mark and I were opening together in the local district, a space built entirely on our own terms, funded by our own hard work. The front door opened and Mark walked in, wearing a pair of casual jeans and a dark sweater. He had just come back from a weekend run down the beach line. He looked healthy, relaxed, and his eyes carried a deep, quiet certainty that hadn't been there during the chaotic months of our old life. He walked up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist, resting his chin on my shoulder as we looked out the window at the blue horizon. "I talked to my mom this morning," Mark murmured, his voice warm and steady against my neck. "She's officially finalizing the sale of the old suburban house this week. She bought a small cottage up near the northern lakes. She sounds happy, Chloe, really happy. She told me to tell you that she's planting white roses in her front garden this spring." I smiled, a genuine thick warmth rising in my throat as I reached back to squeeze his hand. "That's beautiful, Mark. She deserves a garden that belongs entirely to her." I looked down at the simple, elegant silver band on my left hand, not the extravagant wedding ring we had planned during the height of the family circus, but a quiet, private ring we had exchanged on a beach 3 weeks ago, with only Helen and my brother present as witnesses. It wasn't a corporate event. It wasn't a social showcase. It was just a promise between 2 people who had looked into the abyss of a lie, cleared away the wreckage, and chosen to build a life on solid, transparent ground. For a long time, I thought that protecting my mother's feelings and keeping the peace was the definition of being a good daughter. I had allowed myself to live in a world where appearances mattered more than the truth, but as I looked out at the wide, limitless expanse of the ocean below our balcony, I knew that the screen mirror wasn't a tragedy. It was a rescue mission. It had stripped away the rot, freed Mark from an idolized lie, freed Helen from a predatory marriage, and given us the clean slate we needed to build a love that could withstand any storm. The script our parents had written for us in the dark was meant to end in a lifetime of hidden manipulation. But they forgot that when you build a house of cards, the person who turns on the light isn't the destroyer. They're the architect of the real structure that comes next. And the space Mark and I were standing in now was absolutely unshakably our own.